Welcome to Retech, and today we're going to cover the Sinclair ZX Spectrum. It's 40 years old, from 1982 to 2022, and who would have thought that these models would have been running now, all of these years and decades later. And there's been a lot written about the Sinclair machines and Clive Sinclair, or later to be known as Sir Clive Sinclair himself, and I'm guessing most of it's been covered fairly well. But this is just kind of a look at the ZX Spectrum itself. Originally, it was meant to be an upgrade to the ubiquitous ZX81, one of Clive's best-selling computers up to that point. It outstripped and outsold the MK14 and the ZX80. Now, the ZX81 did have a few shortcomings. It wasn't color graphics. It didn't have any real graphics. It basically used a version of ASCII or PETSCII, or very similar to the Commodore PET, and it was mainly character driven. So we were kind of moving from the this is a computer era, and to learn about them and to get to grips with what they're all about, into the computer graphics and gaming era. And machines had to compete. They had to have color, they had to have sound, they had to have decent high resolution graphics, and these were the things that were being pushed by a lot of manufacturers. It kind of started off a little bit further back with the Atari Computers. Now, they were the machines that everybody really were looking to as to set a kind of standard, which they did. The graphics and sound on those machines were well ahead of most things that were out there at the time. So Sir Clive, or Clive as he was known then, knew at the time that this is the direction things were needed to go in. But also, at the time, you had the BBC chasing around for a new brain to become part of their IT focused series about getting people into computers, explaining what they're all about, and basically moving the UK into the most computer literate country in the world. And that was the plan, the government's plan and the BBC's plan. But because of open letters by Chris Curry of Acorn Computers and Clive Sinclair of Sinclair Research and a number of other manufacturers to the BBC BBC opened it up to all comers. But they kind of didn't really have a choice, because the Newbury New Brain was never going to be ready in time. It was actually a Clive Sinclair original model. The design for the Newbury New Brain was a Sinclair Radionics design, and it came out of basically Clive Sinclair's stable of companies, and it was then sold on by the NEB to Grundig or Newbury at the time. So the ZX Spectrum was born into a world of being a computer for the masses and for educational needs. That's where Sir Clive, or Clive Sinclair, was kind of pushing it at the time. That's where he envisaged his machines to be going. But as we all know, that really didn't become the true path for the ZX Spectrum. Now, that's kind of an abridged version of how the Spectrum came about. It was beaten by the BBC Micro from Acorn Computers to be the front machine for the BBC micro computing programs, and that really didn't sit well with Clive Sinclair, because he always thought his machines were more than just games, and he was quite adamant that his machines could do a lot more than games machines, even though they were outselling the BBC by many factors to one. But that still wasn't good enough. But let's have a look at how this machine was spawned and the variations of this machine that came across once Sir Clive got his ZX Spectrum, or his ZX82 or ZX82 color computer, which it was originally meant to be known as, into the market as the ZX Spectrum. Okay, so this Sinclair ZX Spectrum, wasn't as clear cut as most people think. I think a lot of people think there was just one model of the ZX Spectrum, when in fact there were dozens. And you might think, well, no, we had the probably 3 or 4 different variants from the Sinclair to the Amstrad range, but we didn't. And I'll go through a few of them now. Originally, we had the 16K variant. It was the cheaper end model. It started from about £129 in the UK, and for that you got a polystyrene box, a ear and microphone lead connected to a cassette tape, a RF connector, a power supply, a couple of manuals including the welcome guide and the basic manual, and also throughout its life the Horizons tape, which, you know, was quite a good introduction to the machine. But the price of the 16K Spectrum basically knocked the socks off of its competition, and that's why it did so well. The problem is it was slow out of the door. Sinclair had problems shipping the machine, so it kind of gave initially some other manufacturers time to catch up to Sinclair's marketing. And it had a rubber keyboard, which was very cost cut. It's a very cheap way of making a keyboard work on such a small machine. It doesn't do too bad though, because the amount of rubber keypads that you see that have failed are not that many. They don't tend to split, they don't wear that much in relation to other keyboards, and the feeling never really goes away. It's kind of dead feeling, and that's why I got the nickname of the dead flesh keyboard. It was a 2-piece plastic shell with a metal faceplate, which again had the Spectrum Rainbow moniker on there. Apart from that, that was it. It was a nice piece of design, really. It was compact, lightweight, and most of all very cheap to produce. And the initial batch of Spectrums, and in fact Spectrums throughout its life of this model, used components which were inherently faulty, which had failed their production tests. So for example, memory chips, RAM chips, they were all production failures. So you could find that you have, even in a 16K machine, a lot more physical memory than is actually being reported by the machine, because the machine only used the good parts of the memory. And you know, it's not a bad way of keeping costs down, especially when memory was quite expensive at the time. Now, the next in line was obviously the 48K version, which looked pretty much identical. Same ports, same keyboard, same everything, just onboard 48K memory, which is the 48K you had access to. A lot of these machines came with a lot more than that, 64K etc. on board, but only 48K usable. But there was no real difference between the machines. There were revisions of the motherboard, and as each revision of the motherboard went up, they fixed a few faults and a few bugs, but they also reduced the cost of production, which again was always his goal, because the 8-bit machines became a race to the bottom as far as prices were concerned, and that was something that eventually killed machines such as the Texas Instruments TI-99, and it eventually made a lot of other computer manufacturers find it was not really viable to produce these machines, or machines like this, at such small profit margins. Now, the next version of this ZX Spectrum was the bigger cased brother, which was the Plus. And here we have a 48K Plus ZX Spectrum, and you know, electronically inside it is very much a standard Sinclair 48K system board. No real differences on it at all, but it had a nicer case and arguably a better keyboard, although it was quite difficult to type on still because of these little curved indentations on a square key, which made it a little awkward because you could always press two keys together without really realizing it, because the key was actually square and very close to each other. But you know, if they'd spaced the keys out a little bit more and made it a more of a neutral rounded style, then that would have been a lot nicer. But again, it was kind of based on the moldings of the QL really, or the style of the QL, which, to be honest, the QL keyboard is much better than this, and much nicer to use and much better quality, or it feels that way when you use it, which does make a lot of difference. Other than that, 48K Spectrum, they did do upgrade products where you would be shipped literally a case and the components for the reset, and that was quite a cheap upgrade. But the problem was, people who were going after these machines initially thought that this was an upgrade on the basic standard Spectrum, and it really wasn't. It had the same sound system, the same beeper, piezo speaker, etc., the same limitations on graphics and memory. I mean, the advertising for this machine was very slick, where it actually made the move between these two machines on screen, and it was very good. It was very good for the day. In fact, to be honest, it was a very good advert, even for kind of modern standards. Decent kind of music which kind of fit the product, and also the way it was kind of presented. It was a good advert, but that kind of made people think they were getting an upgrade. So the final model in the range of the classic traditional Sinclair machines is the 128K ZX Spectrum. Now this hasn't got its heatsink on it because it has a Harlequin board inside of it. It doesn't need it. It's a modern recreation of the 128K Spectrum board, because my 128K machine is actually being worked on, because it has a few issues, but yeah, I'll get there eventually. And this is literally an identical machine in the way it performs anyway to a standard 128K. It was literally a Spectrum Plus style case with 128K board with the option for a keypad, and also it had better sound. It used the AY sound chip, which is not a bad sound chip overall, and it gets a bit knocked by its detractors now and again when you compare it to the SID chip, etc., but it wasn't a bad sound chip, and it was predominantly the same one that was used in the Atari machines. So this wasn't an overall bad machine. It was definitely an upgrade. So if you got the 128K version, you were then getting an upgrade on the standard ZX Spectrum. But most of the peripherals would work. Again, it used a tape drive. You could get micro drives. The reset switch was on the side, and that was about it really. I mean, it wasn't a bad machine. It had the same keyboard. It had the same kind of feeling on the keyboard. I'm sure that when we used them, we got used to them in the same way as we got used to the rubber keys, but it was a step up from the rubber keyed machine. As an aside, the Harlequin 48K or 128K variants of these was another form of the Sinclair machines, and it's something that actually people were doing back in the early 1980s when the Spectrum was current. They were building clones or licensed clones of the ZX Spectrum. So this really isn't that far away from what they were doing back in the early 1980s. Now, one of them was the Timex 2048, okay? This is the Timex Computer 2048. It's not known as the Timex Sinclair machines, so which is some of the American market, the silver one with a very similar keyboard. It is a machine that was built under license, and there's quite a few different variants of this machine, because you have them with a beeper speaker, you can have them with a normal speaker, you can have the motherboards which are very slightly different to what's inside of here. And you know, it was just like the original Spectrum, there were evolutions on the board. Couple of nice things about the Timex Computer 2048 was had a built-in joystick port, which was sadly lacking on the ZX Spectrum machines, the original ones. It also had a monitor out, which again were composite, as well as your TV or RF out. Now this is a PAL machine. It came from Portugal when I actually bought it, and it's basically uses the same 9-volt power supply, the same keyboard as the Timex Sinclair 2068, and it's not a bad machine, and it's almost 99.9% compatible with the original ZX Spectrum. But again, it was a licensed clone, and it wasn't a bad machine overall. I actually, to be honest, prefer typing on this keyboard rather than the Spectrum Plus and Plus 128 models. It's actually physically nicer because the keys are spaced and you don't hit two at a time. Now, sticking with the theme of the original ZX Spectrum, we have this, and it looks kind of like a normal ZX Spectrum, but you'll notice a slotted grille on the top and the elongated silver badge. Now this is a Sinclair ZX Spectrum. I know it sounds a bit weird, but it's not a Sinclair ZX Spectrum as we kind of know it. It is very different. It is the predecessor to this, and also the 2068, which was a Timex Sinclair model. You see, this machine really was almost never well, it wasn't released as such. It never had an official release. Some of them kind of got sold, some of them got out there into the wild, some of them got exported back to other countries such as the UK via various means. This again is a PAL machine. It was another Portugal machine, well, actually where I actually got this machine from, and it's very similar to the ZX Spectrum, but it's not. This is a model M33248K. That's basically its model number, which is on the shiny tab just inside the expansion port at the back. And for all intents and purposes, it runs, it works, it acts like a Sinclair ZX Spectrum. But again, it was doing what the Harlequin models are doing today, as cloning the ZX Spectrum. And this again is almost certainly not quite an official clone of the ZX Spectrum. I'm sure it was sanctioned, but because it was never an official release, it is just a clone of a ZX Spectrum. And it's rather weird with its Timex ZX81 16K model case that they produced in the United States. And it's alright. It's quite weird really, because you would never notice unless you really look very closely at it. If you just kind of saw this on a desk, you just assume it was a Sinclair ZX Spectrum. Now, there are no markings on it at all, which there's no serial number etched in, there's no manufacturer etched into it, there's no standards etched into it. EU marks, CE marks, whatever, are not etched into the case at all. And the only model numbers on a silver sticker just under the expansion port here, the edge connector. So yeah, quite a rare machine in the Sinclair world, but you know, it's not that unusual because the Russians were producing a lot of clones of the ZX Spectrum, and if you look online today, you can find a lot of Russian clones still available out there for the Sinclair ZX Spectrum and compatible range. Now, as things kind of progressed, we had the Amstrad Years. Sinclair was in a little bit of financial trouble. A lot of it was because of the distribution setup he had for Sinclair Research, and that distributor actually went bankrupt and owed Sinclair a lot of money. It was rumoured over £1 million at the time. And this kind of was unsustainable with the downturn in general of the sales of Sinclair products, because the QL was a bit of a disaster in terms of sales, and also a Sinclair C5 electric car, which would have probably done a lot better in the 21st century in 2022 than it did in 1980s, because no one was prepared for electric vehicles back then, but that was burning cash. So eventually a deal was struck with Amstrad, and Amstrad then basically reinvented the Sinclair models, and he wanted more cost taking out of the model, which seems a bit odd when you've kind of gone from this, which seems a little bit weird when you've got what is effectively a very cost reduced machine, which kind of seems a world away from this. You wouldn't actually think these two models were related in any way, but they are. This is the first iteration, which kind of used a variant of the 128K Plus board. It was reworked, but it wasn't that far away from the original iteration. It was basically the same machine underneath, and it did have a few software incompatibilities, but in general it wasn't a bad machine. And this is quite a heavy machine with a half decent keyboard and a built-in data recorder, as they called it, or cassette recorder. Now this kind of dates it a little bit these days. I mean, if it was cut off here, it would be a lot nicer machine to look at, I think. But again, even cost cutting this model, you had, this is my adaptation for another thing, so you ignore that cable there. You've got 9V DC, you've got MIDI and RS-232. You have a keypad interface, which is straight out of the 128 Plus, RGB, TV and audio out. And you also have 2 joystick ports and a reset key, all on a supposedly cost reduced machine. Now these are nice, generally nice machines to use in 128K mode. In 48K mode they're a bit of a pain because the legends aren't put on the keyboard. This is where he started really cost reducing it. He could have put the same legends on the keyboard so you could use it as a 48K machine, but other than a few like run, load and save, nothing was on there. So it kind of nullified the 48K side of it, other than playing games and loading and saving from cassette tape. But he produced a few other models, again cost reducing it again. The keyboard, although feels very much the same, it's quite decent really. It's a completely different design underneath, and both the keyboards are not interchangeable. But the board had changed dramatically, and you had the addition of a printer port, which again, he's adding features and trying to reduce cost, which it's good for the consumer, but you know, as a standpoint of making more money, it seemed a bit bizarre as how he could cut the costs to that extent and still improve features. Okay, this one has an additional port on the back for plugging in basically modern SD versions of the cassette drives. This one's been modified slightly, but other than that, it's basically the way it left the factory. And do you know what? These are not bad machines. As I said, I would have much preferred to type away on one of these than one of these. And if the ZX Spectrum was like this when it first came out, it would have probably got more interest from the educational market and even the small business market because of the way it looked, acted and felt. And then we have the Plus 3, which is one of these with a disk drive sat on the top, where the cassette drive is. It loses in some of its compatibility with the 128 range of computers, but you know, discs were the way forward at the time. You know, we'd gone a very long time without having a disk drive built into a Spectrum. It meant that the actual software base was very limited for the relatively few numbers of the +3 machines that were out there. Now, the original ZX Spectrum is 40 years old, and the vast majority of them seem to have survived. There are an awful lot of Spectrums for sale on retro forums and retro sites and eBay and so on. Most of them have survived pretty much intact. There are reports of ULAs going bad, which they'd go deaf. There are reports of basically heat causing issues with the ULA as well. There are reports of regulators dying. There are reports of power supplies causing major issues for the board. The main other issue are membranes under the keyboards failing and cracking and falling apart, but in reality they're fairly reliable, and you can get most of the parts, barring the ULAs mainly, off the shelf for a lot of these machines. The ROMs can be blown, the ROMs can be replicated and replaced, which one of my machines I've done a replicated ROM in there because the other one was failing. So that can all be done. The fact that you can still buy new cases, new keyboards, new membranes, new keypads and everything else shows you how popular this machine was and still is. The +2 series and +3 series are much harder to get hold of parts for. Now, you'd have to basically scavenge parts that you couldn't get commercially available from other machines to make a complete working one. You can't get the keyboards recreated or the casings, and also there are issues with the cassette deck because the belts gum up and fail. And you know, this was generally quite a cheap cassette deck, but they're not beyond repair. They are all repairable to a certain extent. So that's really a look at the ZX Spectrum at 40 years old. This little pregnant calculator was a hit. It turned a lot of people's lives and views around of what a computer was and could do. It was eminently useful. It could do more than games. You could get a myriad of peripherals for it. You could do just about whatever you wanted with this machine from a very low cost starting point. And that's what made this machine fly out of the doors, and it's become such a machine that's ingrained in a lot of people's psyche, especially in the UK. There were 3,200 to 4,000 titles produced for this machine that I can find, and there's probably more, and they're being produced almost on a monthly basis even now. And the fan base really in the UK is rival that of the Commodore 64, let alone the other machines combined. So it's going to live for quite a while longer. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this meander through the 40 years of the ZX Spectrum, and I hope you'll subscribe, and I'll hope to see you again soon. So thanks for watching. Thank you.